This talk is going to be about data visualization and storytelling, and mostly data storytelling. But before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I'm a data scientist at GoData Driven. We have a booth here if you want to check it out. There's actually a coding challenge there. But I'm also here on behalf of PyData Amsterdam. So keep in mind, we are organizing a PyData Amsterdam conference next year. You'll hear much more about that. But besides those things, which are quite technical, I'm also a hobbyist storyteller. That means I like writing stories, creating stories. And I always used to think that creating stories was something that was very separate from my day-to-day job, which is very technical. It's all about programming, and stories is like a creative thing. But I actually came to learn that data visualization can be used to tell a story as well. So, you can tell stories with the data that you have. So that's what I'll be telling you about today, how you can go a little bit beyond regular exploratory data visualization and actually use data visualization as a storytelling device. But before we start, I first want to talk about what this talk is not going to be about. It's not going to be about data visualization for data analysis. So if you want to get insights from your data and you're looking for the best ways to get those insights, actually I think you probably have that covered. I'm not going to talk about that specifically. And I'm also not going to talk about what the best plotting library in Python or Julia or R is. Again, that's a preference thing. I've created all of the graphs that I have here just with matplotlib. They're much nicer to use libraries out there probably, and much more fancy tools. But everything that we'll cover here today will be about data visualization as a storytelling device, and is not limited to a specific tool or package. However, what this talk will be about is that I'm going to try to convince you why data visualizations can do more than just represent the data, and why data visualizations can tell a story. And second of all, I'm going to show you what some simple steps are that you can do, even with the simplest of tools, to also tell the story that you want to tell. So let's start at the beginning. First of all, the importance of data visualization. Why do we bother visualizing data to begin with? Because some people have the impression that charts are basically just pretty pictures, while all the important information can be found through statistical analysis and summary statistics. But the best example why that's actually not the case is these 4 data sets by Anscombe, which produce the exact same summary statistics. That means the mean of the x and the y and the correlation and those kinds of things, as all the other data sets. But only when you plot them, it actually shows that these are very distinct and different data sets. So that means that if you have some values, like we have here, an x and a y, you can get to some summary statistics, which should tell you something about the data, probably. But it's only when you actually plot the data that it reveals that this data set represents a dinosaur. This was a drawn dinosaur by Albert Cairo, who's a great guy when it comes to data visualization, to illustrate the importance of visualizing your data to get insights. And this point was even further emphasized with the article Same Stats, Different Graphs, where they exactly use the same summary statistics to produce 13 different data sets that all lead to clearly different visual representations, but if you just look at the summary statistics, they look exactly the same. So, visualization matters. We know that now. You probably also knew that. But what does that have to do with data storytelling? Well, first of all, there are 2 different kinds of data visualization. We have plots like this, the one that we have here, which is a simple scatter plot made with matplotlib, and it is used probably to get some insight into our data, to add to those insights. But then we also have data visualizations like the one over there. And this is clearly a different type of data visualization. All of the visualization that you see here, the colors of the bars, the titles, the orientation of the bars, it all automatically leads you to a certain conclusion. You don't even have to look at the exact numbers that are on here to know what this graph is trying to tell you. And it also means that we can very simply flip that message just by changing some of those aspects. We change the title, we change the color, we change the orientation. And even though these these two graphs show exactly the same data, they lead you to a widely different conclusion. And this illustrates that there is, in fact, two different types of data visualization. The first chart we saw, the simple matplotlib chart, is a clear example of exploratory data visualization. It is a graph that we use or a plot that we make because we have some hypothesis about our data. We believe, for instance, that the customer satisfaction has gone up through our marketing campaign, and we try to verify that hypothesis by experimenting a lot, producing different plots, and getting some more insights. Whereas the second graph is an example of explanatory data visualization. It is not meant to explore the data, it is not meant to get an insight into the data, it's meant to communicate a certain very specific insight. And it turns out that the best exploratory visualization is not necessarily the best explanatory visualization either. When you are exploring your data, you have the luxury of time. So you can produce a plot, but you've probably also seen some summary statistics. You also make some different plots. You can analyze the plot that you're looking at to look for the patterns that you see in your data there, because you have that time, because you're analyzing your data. But when you're communicating about your data, when you have found that insight through exploratory data analysis, and you want to tell someone, you want it to be immediately clear from the visualization that you're presenting what their conclusion should be or what they should take from this graph. And it goes beyond that because you probably don't only want to show that you did some work with that visualization, you want to start a discussion or you want to lead them to a certain conclusion. And that's what explanatory data visualization is about. Because explanatory data visualization tells a story. So maybe your analysis revealed that recent changes to a marketing campaign improved the way that people look at your company, and therefore you want to start a discussion of whether to continue with that or recommend to continue with that. Or maybe you've discovered that chickens grow the best on a certain diet, and therefore you recommend continuing with that. The point is, an explanatory data visualization isn't there to be pretty, it's there to support a point. And while data may be objective, the decisions that you make on how to present that data also shapes the story that you're telling. Look at this chart, for example. This is a chart about the population growth in the past 60 years, and it looks like there's quite an increase of population growth. Maybe looks a bit worrying. But if you look at the other graph, which is from the exact same data set, but we chose the limits of the graph a little bit different, it tells a different story. It tells, oh, it's getting really critical here. And I believe that our role as data storytellers is to bridge the gap between clinical and analytical data and tell a story while keeping true to the facts. So how can you make your visualization in such a way that we focus on this discussion that we want to have, the point that we want to make, without being misleading? So how can we tell a story with our data? Like I said, I'm a hobbyist storyteller. I like writing stories. And what we usually think about when we think about stories, the three aspects, which are not just beginning, middle, and end, are the place or the context in which the story takes place, the people or the characters in the story, and the purpose or the motivation of the story itself. And when we think about data storytelling, we don't necessarily, of course, have a place or people, but we're also focusing on three things. First of all, on the foundation of the visualization. So how do we choose to represent the data itself, and what decisions do we make there? The focus, what kind of characteristics can we add to our graph or plot to direct the focus of the reader to the point where we want their attention? And third, forward. Why am I showing someone this graph or this plot? What discussion do I want to start, or what do I want them to conclude from this? And that's also what I'll be focusing on in this presentation. So we'll start with the foundation, of course. So this is about how do you choose the right chart and how do you choose to represent your data. Of course, there are lots of different charts out there. There are line plots, scatter plots, pie charts, bar charts, lots of other types of plots as well. And while all of them have some purpose and are good in certain circumstances, some charts are better under certain conditions than others. For example, if we look at these two charts, they represent the exact same information, but if you had to choose which one was clearer to get the trend from, is that option A or option B, I would say that option A is the better choice here, because it's more obvious when you're looking at it what the trend over time is. That doesn't mean that bar charts are bad, it just means that for communicating insights about the trend, maybe the bar chart isn't the right choice. And the same goes for these two graphs. Again, they show exactly the same information, but if you're interested in seeing what is the largest market share, I think the second one is a little bit clearer, because in the first one, the blocks look roughly the same size, whereas in the second one, you can see that it's just a bit bigger. It would have even helped to have a little grid on the background there. So the question is, how do you determine the right chart for your use case? Well, I would say there are two things you can do there. First of all, which I really recommend anyone just do, is experimentation. And experimentation means that you have a specific thing in mind that you want to communicate. For instance, I want to open a conversation about the trend, and for instance, I think it's going down. And you choose a couple of different charts and see which one immediately seems the most sensible. But also, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel all the time. So something that I found very helpful as well is this chart by chartguide.com/poster, which tells you about all the different chart types and which ones are good under certain circumstances. This is actually kind of a very small version of it. The entire poster is a lot bigger, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. But even if you choose the right chart, there's still a couple of things regarding how you represent the data that you also should keep in mind. But first, what's important is to make sure that your reader, or the person who you're presenting to, is familiar with your type of chart. This might sound very obvious, but a mistake that I very often see happening is that, we as data scientists, we like things like confidence intervals and error labels and those kinds of things, because they give you a lot more insight into the data. They give you some idea about how precise the measurement is. They can give you ideas about new things and new hypotheses that you have to try out. But it's probably a little bit too cluttered and not very clear for the person who you're presenting to, who's usually not necessarily a data scientist. So, for example, box plots, take these box plots, for example. These are box plots that represent the attack value for all the different Pokemon types, and they communicate a lot more. They also communicate not just the mean or the median, but they also something about the range of the values there. And there's just a lot going on here. So when I show you this as data scientists, you probably recognize box plots. But box plots are not as common outside of exploratory data analysis as you might think. So if you have something like this on a slide, you're probably also going to have to show this in the slide before, where you explain how the interquartile range is calculated, how that relates to the lower whisker and the maximum whisker, and what kind of conclusions you can draw from that. And if you have to show this before you show the box plots, you're probably going to lose your audience there. So it's not a very clear way to clearly communicate. The second point is, choose the data to display carefully. So we already saw that in this example, where the limit and the range of the axis actually makes a lot of difference in first impression that you get from the chart. And this might be obvious, but it's something to really keep in mind. And very often when you make a visualization, even if it's an easy visualization, you have a lot of choices there that you have to make. For instance, these are, again, 3 examples of the exact same data set where it's about the total sales of 2 booksellers. And in the first one, even though you can read the axis and you can draw the conclusions from that, your first impression is going to be that bookseller A is a lot more successful than bookseller B. Whereas if you change the ranges to start at 0, like you should, the difference becomes a lot smaller. And if you then change it again, because you're no longer in the, representing the axis in the volume, but you represent it in the percentages, the bars for bookseller A and bookseller B look even more closely together. So by simply changing the range and the units, you go from bookseller A is a lot more successful to, well, they're kind of about similarly successful. So again, the way you represent your data in that sense matters. And another thing that you should also take into account is how you choose to deal with data that you're not representing. A very common mistake that you see, especially with elections in the media, is that when the first results are getting in, they represent the chart like this, where you can see, oh, apparently Clinton is doing a lot better than Trump. But actually, that is a conclusion that you're drawing from this graph. But that's not a conclusion that you can draw yet, because a lot of the data is not in yet. So these two graphs give off a very different impression. And as data storytellers, unlike fiction storytellers, we have an obligation to stay close to the truth. That being said, let's move on to the second topic. Let's say that you have the right chart, you know how to represent your data. How can we lead the focus or grab the attention of the reader and point it towards the part of the chart that we want them to look at? For this, I'm going to do a little experiment. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers, and I want you to count the amount of 5s that you see here. Ready? All right, how was that? You probably could find the 5s in here, but it took you a little bit of time because you had to sift through all of the information that you saw here. However, if I represent the exact same information in a slightly different way, like this, it's probably much easier to spot the 5s, which is where I want to draw your attention to. And color is not the only thing that can lead your attention somewhere. For instance, if we look at shapes, the 1s and the 8s here are in the exact same spots, but the 1s are probably easier to spot than the 8s because the shape is more distinctly different. When we are creating data visualization for explanatory purposes, we probably have something specific in mind that we want to communicate. And if we use visualization, the visualization that we use to get that insight, it's probably going to be too cluttered, and you have to explain to people where to look. Whereas you can also direct the attention of the person that you're presenting to the right thing. For example, if we have a graph like this one over here, where we have the goals of the European Championships in the group phase, it's a nice graph. It's one that I would use for exploratory purposes. But why am I showing you this? What's interesting about it? What is it that stood out to me that I want to tell you? It's not exactly clear because there's a lot going on here. However, if I change just one thing, which is the color, your attention will immediately be drawn towards the Netherlands, and you'll probably see that I want to talk about how much better the Netherlands was in the group phase in terms of goals than the other countries that were competing. However, in this case, I would say red is not a good color to use because red has this association of danger and bad. So we probably want to go for something a little bit more positive. Green, for instance. Except green is also not a great color here because it's too similar to the blue, so you probably notice that it doesn't stand out as much as the red did. So a better alternative here would be to choose a more representative color, like orange. The color associated with the Netherlands, of course. And you can even draw more attention to this orange bar by making the other parts of the graph less noticeable, by giving them less color. But it's not just color that you can change. If I want to make a point, I'm also able to adjust this chart even more to make that point. For instance, I can give a little bit of context about the situation here by adding a line and some text to the chart. In this case, a line that indicates what the maximum number of goals in the group phase was 4 years earlier. And it seems here that quite a few countries were quite above that line. So maybe it makes sense if you want to say, make a point about how much more competitive this group phase was, for instance, by highlighting those as well. Again, that is something that we can emphasize with colors. And if you compare this visualization to the one that we started with, it's quite different. Just by changing the colors, adding some text, adding a line, you can convey a lot of information, and the visualization immediately allows you to draw some conclusions, whereas The first one probably just allows you to look at it, to look for those conclusions yourself. Something to keep in mind, though, when you're adding colors is that a lot of the visualization libraries have some default colors, and those default colors are usually chosen to be good or appropriate for colorblind people, so don't deviate from those kinds of things too much. Yeah. But we are not restricted to just using lines of text or lines of colors. It can also really help to create a title. For instance, in this case, we have most languages, most popular subjects in class 3A. This is a data set about a survey that was done among class students of class 3A, and they were asked, do you like this subject or don't you like it? And if you have a title like this, which is positive, you're probably going to verify that title by looking at the first few entries first. Whereas if you have the opposite title, STEM not very popular among class 3A, you're probably going to focus on the last few subjects here. So title is another very effective way of guiding the reader's attention. And you can, of course, combine that with all the previous things that we talked about. For instance, what you see here by adding color and adding a line of information, by adding more context to the graph itself. Because of some simple design choices, your attention is guided to a completely different part of the graph in both of these, or a different part of the data in both of these graphs. And whereas the one on this one over here is focusing on the positive, on the most liked languages, the one on the other side is focusing on the negative. Which brings me to my next point, forward. We want to guide someone's attention to a certain part of the data because we are communicating something and there's a reason for that communication. If I just show you a graph and I'm not saying what we're going to do with it and it just focus your attention, that's very nice, but why am I showing you this? So the question you should always ask is, what should be the takeaway from your visualization? What is the one thing that you want people to take away, or what action do you want them to take that can be either convincing them to make a certain choice, to recommend continuing with something, or to start a discussion about how to improve something. But there should be a point or a purpose to your visualization. Because without an action, no matter how nice your visualization is, people are likely to forget it because there's no reason to remember it. So if you have a visualization like this, again, it's interesting, it's nice to know, but there's no takeaway here. And the same thing here, it looks a bit more negative, like I'm focusing clearly on the part that is not good, but why am I focusing on that part? And what do I want you to do with this? Well, one thing that really helps is just simply change the title to something a lot more active. So the previous title was very descriptive. It was showing you what to focus on. But in this case, we changed the title to something more active and the thing that I would like to discuss with you. And active titles really help there. So we must, we should, something along those, we need, something along those lines. If you really want to focus on why you're showing a certain visualization, it usually helps to do three things. First of all, put the message itself first. So make the title big and bold and about why you are showing this. Then put your supporting point, and your supporting point is the visualization. This visualization is here to support the point that we need to change the way that we teach these subjects to this class. And we don't just show the visualization, the initial visualization, but we add 2 or 3 things that really guide your attention to the right spot. So in this case, the title already guides you to the right spot of the data. The colors and the line that was added immediately focuses your attention. And then it really helps to emphasize the action as well. You don't have to put that under your graph, but it usually doesn't hurt. It can also just be a story that you tell along with your data. But when you show something like this, I don't even have to say anything yet, and you will all know what this visualization is going to be about. Whereas if I showed you the original visualization, I would have to tell you what I was thinking and what the story was. So, and with that, you've converted a simple insight into an actionable one and one that you can effectively communicate. Because data storytelling is the art of successfully communicating about data, and hopefully my talk today has made that a little bit easier for you. With a good chart as a foundation and the right data choices there, knowing that you can use title or colors or text to very easily focus the attention, and lastly, a way to present how to move forward, hopefully you will be able to tell a story with your data. Yeah, thank you for having me here today. I hope I've inspired you to tell stories with your data. If you found this interesting and you actually want to know a lot more about how to do this, I work for Go Data Driven, and we have an academy, and there's actually a data visualization and storytelling course that we offer regularly, so that's something to check out, maybe. But otherwise, I'll be here at the conference the whole day, so please come up and talk to me if this is a topic that you find interesting. Thank you all very much.
Awesome. Very well done. Also, nicely within the time. I think Marijn already asked the question. Yeah, go for it.
What's the name of the dog?
Ender, from the book Ender's Game.
Thank you. Great talk, by the way.
I try to put a picture of my dog in every presentation that I do.
As you should, as you should.
Respect.
You have any other questions? Otherwise, I was wondering, like I used to work in research, and there some of the research group would have an actual creative person on the team, like an artist, that would help them make their visualization, because researchers tend to be not very creative people. It's a difficult combination to get. Do you think that is something that like companies or research groups could benefit from, like actually having a person who knows how to visualize things on the team?
Yeah, so the thing is, when you present things to people and when you present a visualization, a lot of the things about focus is about grabbing their attention. And a nice picture grabs people's attention more than not nice pictures do. So it's nicer to have a nicer visualization. But I chose to do everything with Matplotlib here because for me, for a very long time, I knew how to make exploratory data analysis visualizations, and I thought, well, if I want to make pretty pictures, I'm just not creative enough for that. I don't know how to do it. I don't know the tools. But it turns out there's a couple of small things that can really help you create more compelling visualizations with tools that are not as complicated. So yeah, if I wanted to put something on the website, I probably would ask someone who's a bit more versed in the whole creative thing to make something that's nicer than a Matplotlib plot. But I do think that I was able to improve the pictures that I was offering with some very simple things. So that's why I decided to focus on that. I think companies can benefit from it, but I don't think it's about the tooling. And I think we as data scientists, we have to not only understand the data, but also be able to talk about the data with other people. And hopefully this helps in that respect.
Yeah. So it's a skill that data scientists should work on as well.
Yeah.
Like at least be a little bit more creative with your graphs.
Yeah. Don't think, oh, I don't know how to make those really cool infographics like one of the ones that I showed. So I don't have to bother with this at all. There's a few simple things that you can do as well.
Definitely. Mark?
Thank you, great presentation. I think it shouldn't come as a surprise that a presentation about data storytelling is really put well together. So that's good compliments. And indeed, facts don't speak for themselves. I think you illustrated that. I was just wondering, could you name any instances or examples of cases where you were like, this is definitely not the way to go, right? This is maybe even a misrepresentation of
yeah, so data. I don't have a very concrete example, but I do know that if I look back in my own career as a data scientist, I've often been asked to put together a presentation or a PowerPoint about something. And you know that things are not going well when you put an image in there and you spend like 5 minutes explaining what people should see on the image. I think that's when you're not doing it right, basically.
Thank you.
Do we have any more takers for the cube? Over there. Oh.
Hey. So I think this power also comes with responsibility, right? You can also lie with really good data visualization, right? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So that was something I was a little bit worried about when I was putting together my presentation, because I thought, oh, but I don't want to tell a bunch of people how they can manipulate what people think through these changes.
You don't want to give them ideas.
No, because this, of course, this is the kind of thing that very easily also leads to a misrepresentation of. It also gives you the tools to misrepresent your data and mislead, to force people towards a certain conclusion, even though I don't think that's what you should be doing. So that's why I said, unlike fiction storytellers, data storytellers do have an obligation to stay as close as possible to the facts, to the data. I think you can direct focus and start a conversation through that, but don't misrepresent the facts. Don't do that. Unfortunately, you can do that with everything that I told you, but please don't.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Anyone want to catch the cube? I think you just had a very clear talk then.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here.